Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to Haunted Tales. Tonight, we're venturing deep into Alaska's unforgiving Arctic wilderness during the most terrifying season of all, the endless polar night. For more than 2 months, the sun never rises, and in that stretch of unbroken darkness, people have witnessed things that defy all explanation. What you're about to hear are 10 of the most disturbing true stories from Alaska's frozen frontier, accounts pulled from state troopers, park rangers, researchers, and residents who lived through unimaginable horrors when the land was swallowed by night. These cases are not rumors. They're backed by police reports, missing persons files, medical examiner notes, even emergency radio logs that have been hidden away for decades. When temperatures plunge to 60 below zero and silence hangs heavy over the tundra, something stirs in the darkness. Something that has haunted this land long before modern Alaska was ever mapped. If you're new here, be sure to subscribe to Haunted Tales for more chilling true horror every night. And don't forget to ring the bell so you never miss when the next story drags you into the cold. Now, let's step together into the endless night, where survival is uncertain and the most disturbing truths wait in the shadows of Alaska's polar darkness. The Dalton Highway is more than just a stretch of road. It is a wound carved into the frozen body of Alaska, a scar that runs from Fairbanks through mountains, across tundra, and into the oil fields of the Arctic Ocean. 414 miles of gravel, ice, and wilderness, designed not for comfort but for survival. Truckers call it the Haul Road, but among them, in the long months when the sun abandons Alaska, it has earned another name, the road where the dead still drive. The Dalton was built in the 1970s to support the construction of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. It was never meant for tourists or casual travelers. It is a utility road, built fast and built hard, connecting nothing but silence and snow. For long stretches there are no gas stations, no restaurants, no motels, nothing but wilderness. In summer it is dangerous. In winter it is deadly. Temperatures sink to 60 below zero. Winds whip the snow into white curtains that blind the eyes and choke the lungs. And during the polar night, when the sun vanishes below the horizon for weeks at a time, the Dalton becomes something otherworldly. A black tunnel stretching forever north, lit only by headlights, auroras, and the occasional cruel flicker of a truck stop bulb. It is in this darkness that truckers began whispering about the Phantom Convoy. The earliest mention appears in 1983. Thomas Mallory, a veteran driver out of Anchorage, had taken a fuel haul up past Coldfoot. He had driven the Dalton dozens of times before. He knew the loneliness of the road, the eerie way the spruce trees lined the highway like dark sentries, the way silence pressed against the cab until the only sound was the engine's growl and the faint hiss of snow under the tires. That night was colder than most. The aurora painted the sky green, shimmering like a curtain. Mallory radioed dispatch around midnight, his voice clipped, uneasy. He said a truck had been following him steadily for nearly an hour. Its headlights glowed in his mirrors, never closing the gap, never falling back. He tried hailing it on the CB, no response. He slowed, expecting it to pass. It slowed with him. Finally, the lights blinked out, not dimming, not fading behind a hill, but vanishing as if someone had flipped a switch. Minutes later, Mallory abandoned his rig. Search teams found him days later, stumbling frostbitten toward Wiseman. He survived, but he never returned to the Dalton. When pressed, he repeated only one phrase: the lights weren't real. Stories like Mallory's spread. By the mid-90s, the Phantom Convoy was a common whisper among truckers. Men who laughed at ghosts still admitted in low voices over coffee at Coldfoot's lone diner that they had seen headlights where there should have been none. Mark Eldridge, a 20-year driver hardened by avalanches and storms, shared his experience in 1995. Around mile marker 200, he caught twin beams in his mirror. He described the relief that washed over him first. Like a hand on your shoulder reminding you you're not alone. But after an hour, the relief curdled into fear. The lights never passed. They never swerved. They were too steady, too controlled. And then, as if the night itself swallowed them, they vanished. Eldridge pulled over, leaving the engine idling. The cold bit through his jacket the moment he stepped onto the ice. The highway stretched empty in both directions. Snowflakes drifted in the air, catching in the beams of his own headlights. The forest stood still. And yet, he said later, I felt eyes on me, like something stood just inside the tree line. Not animal eyes, human, watching. Veterans shrugged it off as fatigue, tricks of the atmosphere, mirages caused by temperature inversions. But the stories did not stop. In 2003, the Dalton claimed a man named Daniel Kruger. His story became infamous not only because of his death, but because of the evidence he left behind. Kruger was hauling freight north when he radioed in about a truck following him. Dispatch encouraged him to keep moving. Hours later, his rig was found jackknifed near Chandelar Shelf, his body frozen in the cab. Investigators found his logbook. His last entry, written in cramped handwriting, read, "Still behind me, no truck. Just lights." There were no other tire tracks in the snow. None. The case file still sits in Fairbanks archives, marked as an accident. But among truckers, Kruger's name became tied forever to the Phantom Convoy. In 2011, a rookie driver named Miguel Santos posted his account on a trucking forum. It was his first solo run north. Around mile 170, the road opened into a flat tundra stretch. That was when he saw headlights flare in his mirrors. Relieved, he tried the CB. Silence. The lights followed for 2 hours. When he slowed, they slowed. When he accelerated, they matched him perfectly. I thought maybe it was my boss testing me, Miguel wrote. But when I pulled over, I saw them stop too. For a second, they hovered there. Then, gone. Just black behind me, and the dark was so heavy it felt alive. Miguel refused to continue. He stayed parked until the weak glow of midday twilight appeared, then turned back south. He quit the job weeks later. Among the Inupiat people, stories long predate the Dalton. They speak of Turngeite, restless spirits, sometimes appearing as flickering lights across the tundra. To the elders, the Phantom Convoy is no surprise. The road, they say, cuts through ancient paths where the dead still walk. The headlights are not trucks at all, but spirits imitating the living. For truckers hardened by the road, folklore holds less weight. But even they admit, whatever it is, it doesn't act like anything natural. In 2019, Alex Whitman described his own encounter online. I thought the ghost stories were just to scare rookies. But last winter, near mile marker 250, I saw lights behind me. Stayed there for hours. When I pulled over, they blinked out. I swear something was still there. Watching, waiting. If I'd stepped out, I don't think I'd be here now. His words mirrored Mallory's, Eldridge's, Kruger's, and Santos's. Decades apart, the same terror, the same detail. Headlights that vanish into nothing. The Alaska State Troopers still field calls about phantom vehicles. Officially, they blame fatigue, atmospheric reflections, or ice fog. But among truckers, the explanations ring hollow. The Dalton demands vigilance. Most know the difference between sleep-blurred eyes and the clean glow of headlights, and so the convoy endures. Some believe they are ghosts of truckers who died frozen on the highway, condemned to drive forever. Others whisper of something older, something inhuman that wears the disguise of headlights to stalk the living. But whatever it is, it has not stopped. Every winter, new drivers see it. Every year, new stories are added to the long chain of testimonies, and every time, it ends the same way. A driver, alone in the endless night, glances in his mirror and finds comfort in company, until the lights vanish, leaving only the suffocating dark. The Dalton keeps its secrets. The polar night keeps its shadows, and the convoy still drives. Somewhere out there, even tonight, a trucker is watching his mirrors, heart pounding, wondering if the lights behind him belong to the living. The Seward Highway, stretching from Anchorage down to Seward, is often called one of the most scenic drives in North America. On one side, mountains rise sharp and snow-crowned. On the other, the Turnagain Arm glitters with icy water where beluga whales surface and vanish like phantoms. In the summer, it is alive with light, travelers, and tourists. But in the long, merciless dark of Alaskan winter, this same stretch becomes a nightmare corridor where the mountains seem to lean closer and the frozen sea whispers against the rock as if breathing. Locals have long whispered about the Phantom Convoy. Stories circulate in Anchorage diners and among long-haul truckers who make their living carrying supplies south along the Seward. According to legend, on certain nights of deep winter, when the wind howls through the passes and visibility falls to zero, a ghostly line of military transport trucks emerges out of the blizzard. Headlights blazing, engines rumbling, only to dissolve into nothing as the living drivers pull off to let them pass. The roots of the tale lie in history. In 1942, during World War II, Alaska was a vulnerable frontier. Military convoys ran heavy up and down the Seward, moving supplies, fuel, and men in an urgent effort to fortify the state against possible Japanese attack. In December of that year, one convoy of trucks reportedly left Anchorage bound for the port at Seward, but they never arrived. Archival news mentions heavy snow and avalanches, yet no official record of their recovery exists. Some whispered that the convoy had slipped off the icy highway into the frozen Turnagain waters. Others claimed the mountains swallowed them in a white avalanche tomb. Families of the drivers never received bodies, and so began the whispers that in the deepest dark of the Alaskan night, the missing convoy still runs, headlights cutting through curtains of snow, engines echoing off the cliffs. In 1997, a long-haul trucker named Frank Dawson recounted his experience at a fuel stop just outside Anchorage. His words were later noted by fellow drivers and passed along like gospel. It was 3 a.m, Frank said, his voice steady but tight. The highway was a sheet of ice. Snow was coming down sideways. Visibility maybe 20 feet at best. I slowed to a crawl. Then I felt it first, like a vibration through the road. You ever feel an 18-wheeler before you hear it? The ground just trembles. I thought, okay, someone's coming fast behind me. So I glance in the mirrors and I see the glow. Headlights, high beams, a whole line of them, maybe 6, maybe 8. They were too close. No one should have been moving that fast. Frank pulled his rig as far to the right shoulder as the ice would allow, waiting for the convoy to blow by. But what happened next unsettled him for life. They came up alongside me. I could see shapes, military trucks, canvas-covered beds, silhouettes of men inside. Engines roaring, but muffled, not right. And the strangest thing, the snow wasn't sticking to them. Everything was white out, blinding, except these trucks. They were clean, almost glowing, every headlight sharp as a blade. I tried to make out license plates, unit numbers, but nothing. Just blank metal. And then they were gone. I looked up in the mirror, and the road behind me was black and empty. Frank's story wasn't unique. Others have claimed to see the convoy, sometimes on the cliffs above Turnagain Arm, sometimes vanishing into the fog near Girdwood. Each describes the same: roaring engines, blinding headlights, and a line of military transports, moving far too fast for the deadly road conditions, only to vanish without a trace. The Alaska State Troopers have fielded dozens of calls since the 1970s. A dispatcher's log from 1983 records a shaken motorist reporting that a military convoy nearly ran them off the road near Bird Point. Troopers responded, but no convoy was found. No tire tracks in the fresh snow. In 2005, 2 tourists from Texas dialed 911, claiming they had been overtaken by a long line of old-fashioned trucks with soldiers staring out from the beds. By the time authorities arrived, the tourists were in hysterics, yet the road behind them was untouched. No sign of heavy vehicles, not even disturbed snow on the shoulder. Troopers have long since stopped filing these reports as anything more than possible misidentification. But among themselves, some admit what they really think. If the Phantom Convoy wants the road, you give it to them. Local folklore deepens the dread. Native Alaskan storytellers connect the Phantom Convoy to the hungry dead, spirits doomed to wander the land when their bodies are never properly laid to rest. The missing soldiers of 1942, swallowed by snow or sea, now retrace their last route endlessly, searching for a port they'll never reach. Some say if you look too closely into the cabs of the trucks, you'll see not soldiers but hollow-eyed corpses staring back, their mouths open in a soundless scream, Truckers have their own superstitions. Never honk at the convoy. Never flash your brights. Never try to follow. To disrespect the dead is to invite them to pull you into their endless route. The most chilling modern account comes from 2016, told by a young driver named Amanda. Driving alone south of Anchorage in a brutal storm, she too saw headlights behind her, 8, maybe 10 in perfect formation. She pulled over waiting. They came, she recalled, and every instinct screamed at me to shut my eyes. But I looked, and I saw the driver of the first truck. His face was pale, stiff, lips blue like he'd been frozen. But his eyes, they moved. They locked on mine as he passed. I don't know how, but I felt it, like something reached into me. When the last truck went by, I was sobbing. And then, nothing, just darkness, and my own headlights on the ice. Amanda refused to drive the Seward Highway again after that night. To this day, calls trickle in during the darkest winters. Drivers swear they've been overtaken by a military convoy in impossible conditions. No record ever shows a real convoy on the highway. And yet the stories multiply. A reminder of Alaska's strange power to hold its dead close, to trap their echoes in the snow and ice. The Seward Highway looks beautiful in the daylight, with mountains mirrored in the Turnagain waters. But when the sun vanishes for weeks at a time, when the road becomes a tunnel of ice and shadow, those who drive it know to watch their mirrors carefully. If you see headlights in perfect formation approaching from the storm, you'd best move aside, because the phantom convoy is still running its eternal route. On the desolate stretch of Alaska's Richardson Highway, there is a section locals whisper about in half voices, a section of road where the mountains lean in and the trees huddle together, choking out the light. In winter, when the polar nights swallow the horizon, this part of the Richardson becomes more than a road. It becomes a trap of silence and shadow, where the snow muffles sound and every turn feels like the beginning of a nightmare. The Richardson has been the artery of Alaska for generations, carrying military convoys during the Cold War, hunters heading north, truckers dragging fuel and supplies to Fairbanks. But it has also claimed lives, avalanches, ice-slick crashes, sudden blizzards that bury vehicles in minutes. And among those tragedies, stories have taken root. Tales of travelers who vanished without explanation, and figures who still walk that highway when the rest of the world is sleeping. One December night in 1993, a man named Stephen Cole, a trucker from Idaho, was hauling freight northbound through the worst snowstorm he had ever seen. He later told his wife that the snow was so thick it felt like he was driving through static, like the air itself had turned to white noise. The temperature had plunged below 40, the kind of cold that makes steel groan and bones ache. He kept the heater blasting, the cab smelling of diesel, and the faint metallic tang of the frozen air that crept in through the vents. Somewhere near Summit Lake, his CB crackled to life with a voice that was not on his channel. At first it was just a whisper, broken syllables buried in static. He reached to tune it out, thinking it was bleed from another frequency, but then the words formed clearer. Slow down. Road ahead. Blocked. Stephen slowed instinctively, and as he rounded the bend he saw it, a semi jackknifed across both lanes, abandoned, its trailer split and spilling boxes into the snow. Had he not been warned, he would have plowed right into it, blind in the storm. He picked his way around the wreck, tires crunching over ice. But when he tried to call out on the radio to thank whoever had warned him, the channel was empty. No response. The state troopers later told him they had received no other calls that night, and no truckers had been logged on that frequency in the area. Stephen swore for the rest of his life that someone, or something, had saved him. But the eerie part is what he saw just past the wreck. On the shoulder, half buried in snow, stood a figure in heavy military parka and goggles, unmoving, facing the road. He slowed, leaned over to get a better look, but as the headlights touched it, the figure dissolved into the falling snow. Stephen's story spread among truckers like wildfire, because many had already heard the old legend, the soldier of the Richardson. During the Cold War, convoys carried nuclear material and supplies up this highway to remote bases. One truck, they said, vanished in a blizzard. Its driver never recovered. Some claimed his ghost still warns travelers of dangers ahead, a guardian trapped in endless winter. Others, darker in their telling, insist he is not saving them at all, only keeping them alive long enough to watch the road take them later. Years later, in 2008, a pair of college students from Anchorage, driving to Fairbanks for the holidays, claimed to have seen the same figure. Their car broke down near Isabel Pass, and as they waited for help, they saw a man trudging along the shoulder through the whiteout. He wore outdated military gear, frost crusting his goggles, and though they honked and waved frantically, he never turned his head. They watched him for nearly 10 minutes, moving against the wind without faltering, before he vanished behind a ridge. When troopers finally arrived, they insisted no one else could have been on foot in those conditions without freezing within minutes. The students left the Richardson shaken, refusing to ever drive it in winter again. But the most disturbing account belongs to a woman named Laura McKenna, who in 2017 worked as a nurse in Valdez. She was driving home one night after a double shift, the highway empty, the stars invisible behind storm clouds. Somewhere north of Paxson, she spotted headlights in her mirror, a vehicle approaching fast. Relieved at the thought of another driver, she kept her eyes on it as it gained, but something was wrong. The headlights flickered oddly, dimming and then flaring too bright, and there was no engine sound. When the vehicle drew closer, she realized with dread it was not a car, but a massive military truck from another era, its front grille black and rimed with frost. She swerved slightly to give it room, but as it pulled alongside, she saw no driver behind the wheel. Instead, pale faces pressed against the glass of the cab, lips parted in silent screams, eyes milky and unblinking. She swore she heard a low hum vibrating the air around her as it passed, like dozens of voices whispering from deep underwater. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the truck was gone, swallowed by the night. Laura reported the encounter to no one, except confiding later to a priest that she believed she had seen the dead trapped in an endless convoy. Her description matched details from decades of folklore, stories told in truck stops and whispered in bars. Some truckers believe that certain stretches of the Richardson are cursed. That time folds in the polar nights, and lost convoys are doomed to repeat their routes forever, bleeding into the present. The highway itself feeds the legend. In 1975, a military transport did crash in a blizzard near Isabel Pass, killing everyone aboard. Recovery crews reported strange complications, radios failing, compasses spinning, men claiming to hear voices in the storm. The official report blamed whiteout conditions, but rumors of phantom interference persisted in private accounts. Old-timers still say the crash site is avoided by animals, that even wolves won't linger near it. The most unsettling thing about the Richardsons' ghostly stories is not the individual accounts, but how they overlap. Different decades, different witnesses, but the same eerie details. The military parka, the hollow faces in the cab, the headlights that burn too bright against the storm. It suggests not imagination, but something embedded in the landscape itself. Alaska is full of graves without markers, soldiers lost in avalanches, travelers frozen and never found. Perhaps their unfinished journeys bleed into the living world, replaying again and again where the veil is thin. In 2021, a dashcam video surfaced briefly online before being pulled down. A trucker driving near midnight through a heavy storm captured for several seconds the shadowy outline of a massive convoy ahead of him. Headlights stretched across the snow and dark shapes loomed. But when the camera autofocused, the coastal town of Whittier, Alaska, is one of the strangest inhabited places on Earth. In winter, when the storms roll in off Prince William Sound, the entire settlement seems to shrink into its single gray monolith, the Begich Towers, a relic of military construction where nearly every resident lives. To reach Whittier by road, you must pass through the Anton Anderson Memorial Tunnel, the longest combined rail and vehicle tunnel in North America, a narrow, dripping mile of rock that closes at night. Once the sun dips and the tunnel shuts, Whittier is cut off completely. a community stranded at the edge of sea and mountain, trapped in the long dark of the polar night. The town itself carries scars of tragedy. In 1964, the Good Friday earthquake sent a tsunami crashing into Whittier's harbor, destroying buildings and killing 13 people. Survivors describe the wave as a wall of black water studded with ice and debris, advancing silently until it consumed the shore. Fishermen still tell stories of hearing screams out on the water long after the bodies were buried. Some say the dead never truly left, that the storm-battered coastline is haunted by voices carried on the wind. In 2012, a tugboat captain named Michael Hanley swore that he encountered those voices. He had lived in Alaska his entire life, toughened by the sea, never one for superstition. But after that winter, he refused to dock in Whittier again. He was guiding his vessel toward the harbor late one December night when the water grew strangely calm, the swells subsiding as though the entire sound had fallen asleep. The air smelled metallic like wet iron. Then he heard it, singing. Faint at first, drifting over the water, a woman's voice rising and falling with the wind. He thought it must be the radio, but when he shut it off, the sound only grew clearer, weaving through the rigging like thread. The song was mournful, wordless, and it seemed to come from the black water itself. Michael leaned over the side, straining to see through the fog, and that was when he spotted them. Pale faces just beneath the surface. Eyes open, mouths moving in time with the song. Dozens of them, women and children, their hair fanning like seaweed, staring up at him. He staggered back, screaming for his deckhand. But when the other man rushed over, the water was empty, black and calm as oil. They docked in Whittier shaking, and Michael drank himself senseless to forget. But the next night, alone in his bunk, he heard the singing again, faint and relentless, as though it had followed him ashore. He broke contract the next morning and refused to return. To his dying day, he swore he had seen the drowned of 64 calling him from beneath the harbor. His story might have been dismissed as drink or stress if not for others. In 2016, 2 tourists staying in the Begich Towers reported being woken at 3 a.m. by the sound of knocking on their 12th floor window. At first they assumed it was a prank, until they remembered they were 12 stories above the ground, with nothing but the harbor below. When they pulled back the curtain, they claimed to see a dripping figure pressed against the glass, a young girl with hollow eyes and hair plastered to her skull. The figure opened her mouth, water spilling down her chin, and though no sound emerged, the tourists felt a vibration in their skulls, as though words had been planted directly into their minds. "Let us in." They fled that night, refusing to sleep in Whittier again. Locals do not doubt these stories. Many of the older generation remember the night of the earthquake and tsunami vividly. They remember hearing the cries of neighbors swept into the harbor, cries that were silenced too quickly. Some insist that the drowned linger, restless and angry at being trapped beneath the waves. A fisherman named Joe Atkins, who has worked the sound for 4 decades, put it bluntly when asked, "Whittier's not quiet. People think it's quiet because the storm drowns everything. But when it goes still, when the wind dies, you hear them. You hear the ones who didn't make it. I've heard my own cousin calling me 30 years dead. If you answer, you're theirs. That's why we don't answer voices on the water. Police logs hold stranger details." Between 2000 and 2020, multiple 911 calls came from Whittier residents reporting people in the harbor screaming during winter storms. Responders always found nothing, just waves slamming against the docks. But in several cases, callers insisted the screams included their own names, shouted in familiar voices. One woman swore her drowned husband was calling for her from the ice-choked bay. The officers wrote it off as grief, but the recordings of the calls still sit in the archives, voices shaking with terror as the wind roars behind them. The tunnel itself adds another layer of dread. Drivers say that if you pass through late at night, just before it closes, you sometimes see wet footprints on the asphalt leading into the dark. No one explains how they get there or where they end. A soldier stationed at the tunnel in the 1970s told of seeing a woman standing alone midway through, her dress soaked, her skin pale. He slowed his patrol car, but as the headlights swept over her, she dissolved into spray, leaving nothing but puddles that quickly froze. The soldier never spoke publicly, but his letter to his brother described the terror that followed him for years. Folklore weaves through these accounts. Some native Alaskan traditions warn of the Sea Mother, a spirit who claims those who disrespect the ocean. Others tell of drowned ancestors who return during the polar night, when the barrier between worlds thins. Whether folklore or haunting, the result is the same. Whittier holds a reputation even hardened Alaskans approach with caution. Few willingly spend nights on the water there in winter. The most unsettling modern case came in 2019, when a group of young fishermen anchored offshore reported seeing lights moving beneath their boat at 2 a.m. Thinking it was bioluminescence, they leaned over, only to find pale hands pressed against the hull from below, dozens of them, fingers splayed. The boat rocked violently as though pushed by unseen currents. One of the men later claimed he heard a child's laughter echoing through the metal hull. They cut their nets, abandoned gear worth thousands, and fled to open water without looking back. When divers searched the area weeks later, they found nothing. No logs, no bodies, no debris. Just the silent black water of the Sound. What chills most about Whittier is not the number of stories, but their consistency. Again and again, witnesses describe dripping figures at impossible heights, faces beneath the harbor water, voices calling in storms. Each account adds another layer to the town's uneasy reputation, as though the dead refuse to release their grip on the living. And in the endless dark of the polar night, when the waves crash against the docks and the wind dies for just a moment, locals swear you can hear the truth for yourself. A whisper riding the tide, a knock against your window, a voice you know calling your name from the water. To some, Whittier is a quirk of... The story begins with a stretch of silence that feels older than the earth itself. In the remote interior of Alaska, where the valleys are blanketed by permafrost and the mountains rise like jagged black teeth against the dim twilight, there are places the map records but men no longer go. One such place lies between the ghost town of Flat and the skeletal remains of old mining camps that once thrived in the early 1900s during the Klondike Gold Rush. The road there, little more than a path carved by trucks long rusted into the soil, is said to be haunted not by one story, but by many, layered tragedies that have soaked into the frozen ground. What makes this region particularly disturbing is that, unlike other places in Alaska, here the shadows seem to carry memory, as though the land itself refuses to forget what men did in their hunger for gold. Miners left their dead behind. Some perished in avalanches, their cries drowned beneath tons of ice and snow. Others froze, their bodies curled in cabins where the firewood had run out. And some, if the old journals are to be believed, were lost to something else entirely, something they described as voices in the snow, figures that walked without leaving tracks, and a darkness that stalked the men who dared to work too late at night. For decades, no one returned. Nature reclaimed the place, tearing the wooden camps to splinters, leaving only rusted equipment jutting from the white earth like forgotten bones. But modern isolation has its way of drawing wanderers, and in recent years, truckers cutting shortcuts through the wild, hunters searching for game, and the rare thrill seeker have crossed into this land and come back with stories that chill even the most hardened Alaskan to silence. One such man was Eric Lorne, a freight hauler from Fairbanks. He was no stranger to long, punishing drives through the wilderness, and he scoffed at the idea of ghosts. In February 2017, he agreed to transport equipment from Fairbanks to a small research outpost near Flat. The journey was supposed to take him through miles of unused roadways, ice-packed river crossings, and finally, the stretch of land where the mining camps once stood. Eric left before dawn, the headlights of his truck cutting tunnels through the snow. For hours, nothing stirred except the crunch of tires and the whistle of the wind. Then, near the halfway point, as he descended into a shallow valley, he noticed the air grew strangely still. Snowflakes fell without drifting, as if the wind had stopped breathing altogether. It was there, just beyond the ruins of a collapsed cabin, that he saw the first figure. A man, tall and gaunt, standing in the middle of the path. Eric braked hard, his truck groaning against the ice. He flashed his high beams, expecting the figure to move aside, but it didn't. It just stood there, shoulders hunched, head bowed, arms dangling as though broken. Eric rolled down his window and shouted, but his voice echoed too far, bouncing unnaturally across the frozen valley. The figure slowly raised its head. In the pale glare of the headlights, Eric swore its face was blurred, as if frost itself had grown over its features, with empty pits where eyes should have been. Panicked, Eric reached for his radio to call in the sighting. But when he looked up again, the figure was gone. Eric drove on, his nerves raw, convincing himself it was a trick of the eyes, fatigue playing with shadows. But 5 miles later, at a bend near the frozen river, he slammed his brakes again, because the same figure was standing in the road, closer this time, its head tilted unnaturally to one side. He swerved, his truck skidding dangerously close to the embankment, and by the time he straightened the wheel, the figure had vanished once more. He would later tell fellow truckers that he drove the next 20 miles white-knuckled, unable to look in his mirrors, because he felt something was in the back seat, crouched low, breathing faintly against the glass. Eric's testimony wasn't the only one. Months before, in late 2016, 2 hunters from Anchorage reported finding strange tracks in the snow near the same ruins. They weren't animal prints nor human. They were elongated, narrow impressions that seemed to shift shape halfway across the valley. Following them, the hunters discovered a rusted stove beside a collapsed cabin. On the stove were what appeared to be fresh burn marks, though there hadn't been firewood there for decades. One hunter swore he heard voices whispering in the tree line, low murmurs in a language he didn't understand. The other claimed to see shapes moving between the trees, always just out of focus. Terrified, they fled, but in the weeks afterward, both men reported vivid nightmares of being buried alive in snow while unseen hands clawed at their faces. Local lore ties these encounters to what miners once called the Pale Watchers. In scattered journals left behind, men wrote of beings that came with the polar nights, humanoid in shape but faceless, their bodies blending with the snow. Some miners believed they were the spirits of those who died forgotten, cursed to wander the valleys forever. Others whispered they were something older, guardians of the land, punishing those who trespassed for greed. Archaeologists dismiss this as myth, pointing instead to starvation, isolation, and madness brought on by the endless darkness of Alaskan winters. But for those who have seen the figures in recent years, explanations offer little comfort. In March 2019, authorities investigated a missing persons case in the same region. A snowmobiler named Hannah Reed vanished while riding with friends near the ruins. According to her companions, Hannah rode ahead, disappearing briefly around a curve. When they followed moments later, her snowmobile was found abandoned, engine still running, tracks leading into the open snow. Yet Hannah herself was gone. Search teams scoured the valley for days. Dogs lost her scent abruptly at the frozen river, as if she had stepped into the air and vanished. The only thing recovered was her helmet, found upright on the snow beside the ruins, with no prints around it. To this day, she has not been found. Locals whisper she was taken by the Pale Watchers, her soul claimed by the same icy figures that had haunted miners a century before. Even now, truckers who dare cross the route after midnight tell of headlights appearing behind them with no source vehicle, of radios crackling with faint voices speaking names they shouldn't know, of shadows running alongside their trucks before dissolving into the darkness. Those who stop to rest near the ruins often report waking with frost inside their cabins, even if the heater runs high, and with the unsettling feeling that someone had been standing inches from their bed, staring at them through the night. The road through those valleys remains unmarked, its dangers passed by word of mouth. Those who believe dismiss it as superstition born of fatigue and cold, but others know better. They say the land remembers that the blood of the gold rush never washed clean, and the spirits left behind do not forgive. Even now, in the depth of Alaskan winters, when the polar night stretches across weeks of endless dark, drivers whisper a warning: never stop near the ruins, never answer if you hear your name in the wind, and above all, never look too long into the snow, because if you do, the snow may look back. Bering coast of Alaska is a place of staggering beauty and unrelenting cruelty, where the sea stretches like an endless sheet of iron under the polar night sky. Out here, storms rise without warning, swallowing vessels whole. For generations, coastal villages have spoken of spirits that live in the water, ancient watchers older than the tides themselves. Fishermen whisper that the ocean keeps what it wants, and sometimes it doesn't just take bodies, it takes souls. Among the dozens of tragedies whispered about in these waters, one story has spread with a persistence that unsettles even seasoned sailors. The tale of the vessel Aurora Dawn, a small trawler that vanished off the coast near Nome in January 2012, leaving behind a trail of chilling witness accounts and one unanswered mystery that still lingers in the minds of those who dared to look into it. The Aurora Dawn was a modest 60-foot boat crewed by 6 men, hardened Alaskan fishermen used to spending weeks out on the sea. On January 14th, the trawler left port, intending to fish the waters near St. Lawrence Island. The weather reports warned of snow squalls, but nothing dangerous. The captain, Martin Hale, was confident, a man who had been fishing the Bering Sea for 30 years. But 2 nights into the trip, radio transmissions from the Aurora Dawn grew strange. Instead of routine check-ins, other vessels picked up fragments of hushed conversations, the sound of men arguing in low voices. A nearby fishing boat, the Northlight, reported hearing what sounded like frantic whispers broadcast over the open channel, not directed at anyone. When the Coast Guard later pulled the recordings, the tapes revealed something even more unsettling. Among the crew's voices was another voice, faint, guttural, speaking words that no one could identify. The last clear transmission from the Aurora Dawn came at 2:13 a.m. on January 16. Captain Hale's voice, shaken but steady, reported, "We have someone on board who isn't supposed to be here." There was silence after that. No coordinates, no explanation. Just the hollow static of an open mic before the transmission cut off. The Aurora Dawn never returned to port. When the search began, rescuers expected to find debris scattered across the ice-cold water, maybe bodies washed ashore. But the sea gave nothing. Not a plank, not a life vest, not even an oil slick. It was as though the vessel had been erased. The Coast Guard expanded their search, combing hundreds of miles of ocean. But all they found was a buoy washed up near the village of Gamble. Locals there, members of the Yupik community, warned that the men had likely angered the Sea Mothers, ancient spirits said to dwell in the deep. According to their oral tradition, these spirits appear during the long winter nights, taking the form of pale figures who rise from the water, dripping with ice, climbing aboard boats to claim those who disrespected the sea. The elders advised that no one speak the names of the lost aloud at night, lest the spirits hear and return. Yet witnesses soon came forward with accounts that suggested something far stranger. On January 17th, a cargo ship passing through the same waters reported seeing a lone light bobbing in the fog. Believing it to be a distress signal, they turned toward it. The crew swore they saw a small vessel drifting silently. But as they drew close, the boat's lights extinguished all at once, and when they reached the location, nothing was there. Radar showed empty sea. The cargo captain logged the sighting but refused to let his crew speak of it publicly, fearing ridicule. Still, word spread among sailors in Nome, growing darker with every retelling. More disturbing was the testimony of a hunter in Savunga, who claimed that on the night of the 16th, while checking his traps near the shoreline, he saw a fishing vessel out at sea. Through binoculars, he said he spotted figures standing along its deck rail, too many to be a normal crew, their bodies stiff and pale against the darkness. They didn't move like living men. He watched until the fog rolled in, swallowing the vessel. When investigators asked him to describe the boat, he hesitated before whispering, "It looked like the Aurora Dawn," but wrong, like the sea had remade it. The families of the lost men still live with the silence left behind. One wife described receiving phone calls days after the disappearance where only the sound of rushing water could be heard on the line. Caller ID showed no number. Another crewman's brother claimed to have seen his sibling's face reflected in a window on a stormy night, mouth open as if screaming, eyes glazed with seawater. These accounts were dismissed as grief-stricken hallucinations, but they match a pattern known among local mariners. When the sea takes someone during the polar nights, their presence doesn't just vanish, it lingers. Years later, in 2016, a Coast Guard cutter patrolling near the Diomede Islands picked up a faint distress signal. At first, the crew assumed it was static interference, but when they decoded the faint Morse pattern, the call sign was unmistakable. Aurora Dawn, a vessel declared lost 4 years earlier. No trace of the boat was found that night, and when the signal was replayed, the call sign had warped, as though the letters were melting into static. There are those who now believe the Aurora Dawn is still out there, condemned to wander beneath the polar sky, appearing only when the night is deepest and the sea is most unforgiving. Mariners whisper that if you see a trawler with no lights but hear voices carried across the waves, you must turn away, because the dead call to the living in hopes of pulling more souls into the cold abyss. Some say the crew of the Aurora Dawn were not merely lost but taken, claimed by whatever ancient power dwells in those waters, forced to join the spirits who board ships in silence, dripping salt and ice. In Nome even today, fishermen pour out a measure of drink before leaving port, a quiet offering to the sea. Some carve protective symbols into their decks, lines older than Christianity, shapes passed down from their ancestors. They know the ocean hungers, especially during the endless nights when the sun refuses to rise, and when they sail past the stretch of water where the Aurora Dawn vanished. Many refuse to look too closely into the fog, for fear they might see figures on a phantom deck, standing still, waiting for someone to notice. The official records list the Aurora Dawn and her crew as lost to the sea, cause unknown. But in the taverns of Nome, late at night, when the winds howl and the waves batter the shoreline, old men tell a different truth. They say the Aurora Dawn still sails, trapped in a loop of death and silence, her crew no longer living, no longer dead, but caught in the eternal pull of the polar night. And they warn the young to listen closely if ever they hear a voice on the radio at sea, faint, broken by static, whispering a call sign that should no longer exist. Because if you answer, you may find yourself drawn into the same fate, forever adrift, a passenger on a ghost ship that refuses to sink. In the endless silence of Alaska's interior, where the night stretches for weeks and the cold can shatter steel, there is a place most maps no longer mark. It lies 70 miles north of Bethel, hidden in valleys of snow and surrounded by forests that look the same in every direction. Few remember its name, and those who do speak it softly, Murphy Airstrip. Built in the 1950s at the height of the Cold War, it was intended as a refueling and emergency landing site for military flights. For a decade, planes touched down there regularly, soldiers patrolled its perimeter, and barracks hummed with the sound of life. But by the late 1960s, the base was abandoned. Equipment was stripped, power was cut, and the runway was left to vanish beneath snowdrifts. Now, little remains but a collapsing control tower, half-buried hangars, and a strip of ice that glimmers like a scar under the polar night. Officially, it is forgotten. Unofficially, it is a place of whispered warnings. For years, bush pilots have reported strange lights near the abandoned strip. Some claim to have seen the ghostly outline of a plane descending, only for it to dissolve into the fog. Others say they've heard radio signals bleeding into their headsets on approach, old military call signs long decommissioned, voices calling coordinates that no longer exist. Hunters tell of hearing engines overhead in perfect silence, looking up to see nothing in the sky. Most brush it off as tricks of the atmosphere, aurora interference with equipment, or fatigue. But among those who live closest to the ruins, there are darker tales, stories of soldiers who never left, of aircraft that crashed in storms and were never recovered, and of something inhuman that walks the airstrip at night. One of the most chilling accounts came from a pilot named David Mercer. In 2003, Mercer was ferrying supplies to a mining camp when a sudden storm forced him to seek emergency landing. The only option within range was Murphy Airstrip, a place he'd only heard about in barroom warnings. With fuel low and visibility near zero, he set his small Cessna down on what remained of the runway. He described the landing as unnerving. The strip, though abandoned for decades, appeared strangely clear of snow, as though swept by unseen hands. The winds died abruptly as he taxied to a stop, his engine ticking in the silence. That was when the radio crackled. At first, it was only static. Then a clipped voice came through. "Tower to Cessna 3251. Cleared for landing, proceed to hangar bay." The transmission was unmistakably military, calm and firm. But Murphy had no tower anymore. No personnel, no electricity. Mercer, shaken, responded anyway, his voice trembling as he confirmed he had already landed. There was no reply, only static. He tried the frequency again, switching channels, but the voice was gone. Outside, in the dim glow of his landing lights, he thought he saw figures standing along the edges of the runway. At first he assumed they were searchers, men in old parkas, their outlines blurred by snowfall. But when he blinked, they were gone. Mercer later told investigators that as he sat frozen in the cockpit, the entire strip lit up. Floodlights that hadn't worked since the 60s blazed into life, bathing the ruins in stark white. He swore he heard the roar of engines above, saw the shadow of a massive aircraft descend through the cloud cover. For a heartbeat, he thought another plane was landing. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the light died, leaving only blackness and the sound of his own blood rushing in his ears. He took off again as soon as he dared, nearly crashing in the crosswinds, vowing never to return. Mercer's testimony was not unique. 2 years earlier, in 2001, a group of snowmobilers passing through the valley reported hearing marching footsteps across the airstrip at night. Not just a few steps, but dozens, an entire platoon. They described the sound of boots crunching in rhythm across the ice, metallic clinks as though rifles were being carried, voices shouting faint commands in a language blurred by the wind. Yet when they scanned the flat expanse with flashlights, nothing stirred. Their machines refused to start for hours afterward, batteries drained as though leached by some invisible force. One man claimed to see silhouettes moving in the control tower windows, their heads jerking mechanically, like puppets repeating forgotten drills. Local lore ties Murphy Airstrip to a series of unexplained disappearances in the late 1960s. According to declassified reports, 3 transport planes vanished on routine flights between Anchorage and Nome, their last coordinates placing them within a 50-mile radius of Murphy. Wreckage was never found, though search parties combed the area for weeks. Villagers nearby spoke of hearing explosions in the sky, followed by glowing orbs descending into the forest. Some insisted they found strange scorch marks along the tree line, circles in the snow where nothing grew back in spring. Military officials denied these claims, but after the 3rd disappearance, Murphy was shut down permanently. Even now, bush pilots whisper about the phantom tower that hails them during storms. Some ignore it, others turn off their radios entirely when flying over the valley. But a few, tempted by desperation, have listened. A pilot in 2015 confessed over whiskey that he followed the tower's instructions to descend when his instruments malfunctioned. He claimed he saw the runway below glowing faintly green under the aurora. He brought his plane lower, trusting the invisible voice guiding him. At the last moment, his co-pilot screamed and pulled the yoke. They narrowly avoided crashing into a frozen riverbed. The runway, he said, had never been there at all. And yet, he swears he saw men on the ground waving him in. What unsettles investigators most are the strange radio recordings that continue to surface. Static-laden transmissions of call signs long retired, clipped commands to planes that no longer exist, even emergency codes from the 1960s repeating in loops. Audio experts chalk it up to atmospheric anomalies, old signals bouncing endlessly in the ionosphere, trapped echoes from decades past. but the timing is too precise. These signals always appear when the polar nights are deepest, when the valley is shrouded in endless darkness. The most disturbing story, however, comes from a hiker named Jason Laird. In 2019, he and two friends camped near the ruins, curious after hearing tales of Murphy's hauntings. On the second night, Laird woke to the sound of jet engines overhead. He stumbled outside, expecting to see a cargo plane roaring across the sky. Instead, he saw the entire airstrip alight, brighter than day. Soldiers marched in formation across the snow, rifles on shoulders, their faces indistinct, blurred like frost on glass. An officer barked commands from the tower, his voice ringing hollow in the night air. Laird said the figures marched past him without a glance, their boots inches from his feet, yet leaving no tracks behind. The noise swelled until he thought his skull would split, then stopped. He collapsed in the snow, and when he woke, the camp was silent, his friends sleeping as though nothing had happened. He left Alaska weeks later and has never returned. To this day, Murphy Airstrip sits forgotten. The government claims it is dangerous due to collapsing structures, nothing more. But hunters still avoid the valley, and pilots Far out on the Alaskan coast, where the mountains descend into black water and the nights linger for months, there are villages that seem to exist on the edge of two worlds. One such place, a settlement so small it never appears on tourist maps, sits near the mouth of a river that freezes solid each winter. Locals call it Kalak. On paper, it is nothing more than a scatter of cabins, a single store, and a fishing dock battered by storms. But those who grew up there carry stories that outsiders find difficult to dismiss. Tales of nights when the air grows too still, when dogs refuse to go outside, and when figures appear on the edge of the village, waiting, watching, moving closer with each passing hour. The legend of Kalak is old. Long before the village was founded by Russian traders in the 1800s, the Yupik told of spirits that roamed the riverbanks. They described them as tall, thin shadows that walked in silence, sometimes in groups, sometimes alone, always faceless. The elders warned that to meet their gaze was to invite death, for they would follow a person home and drain the warmth from his body until he was little more than ice. The villagers called them the Kalupalik, but unlike the child-snatching creatures told in bedtime stories, these figures were said to target anyone, grown or young, especially those who wandered too far from the firelight. When Russian traders first built their outpost, journals recorded strange happenings almost immediately. Hunters disappeared within sight of the river. A trapper was found frozen upright, eyes wide, his rifle still in his hands. The men wrote of distant singing carried over the ice, voices that never seemed to come from one direction, but from all around at once. They abandoned the post after only 3 winters. Yet the families that later settled Kaluk stayed, believing the land could be tamed. Through the years, incidents piled up. In 1931, an entire fishing crew vanished while hauling nets in the bay. Their boat washed ashore intact, gear neatly stacked, fire still smoldering in the stove. Not a single man was ever found. In 1954, school records note a night when children refused to sleep, claiming there were faces pressed against the windows of their cabins. The teacher wrote that even she saw shadows crossing the snow outside, though no footprints were found come morning. Elders insisted these were warnings, signs that the figures had returned. What makes Kalak more than just folklore, however, are the modern testimonies. In 1999, a hunter named Paul Nuyak told police he and his cousin tracked caribou north of the river. As night fell, they set camp, but were awakened by crunching snow around their tent. Assuming wolves, they unzipped the flap. Standing in the pale light were 3 figures, thin as poles, heads tilted slightly as though curious. They had no faces, only smooth, dark skin like shadows given form. Paul fired his rifle, but the sound seemed muffled, swallowed by the night. The figures did not flinch. Instead, they began to walk, not away, but closer. Terrified, the men fled on snowshoes, abandoning gear. They did not stop until sunrise. Paul swore that as they ran, he felt a cold breath on the back of his neck, though nothing touched him. In 2012, 2 state troopers were dispatched to Kalak after repeated reports of missing snowmobilers. Their official log notes poor weather conditions and limited visibility, yet one entry stands out. 2:47 a.m., heard female voice calling for help. Source not found. Both officers confirmed, snow undisturbed. The next morning, villagers said they too heard the cries, drifting across the ice. But when they gathered lanterns to search, no one was there. Troopers later refused interviews, saying only that Kalak was strange country. Perhaps the most chilling account came from a teacher who worked in Kalak's small schoolhouse during the winter of 2017. In a recorded interview, she described staying late to grade papers when she noticed movement outside the window. Thinking it was a parent, she stepped to the door. The snow was untouched, yet the motion continued, black shapes sliding along the edge of her vision. That night, she was woken by knocking on her cabin wall, slow, deliberate, 3 raps at a time. When she peered through the window, she saw a figure crouched low in the snow, as if waiting for her to come outside. She left Kalak the next morning on the first bush plane out, refusing to ever return. Skeptics argue these are nothing but stories fueled by darkness and isolation. They say long nights warp the mind, fatigue creates illusions, and the human brain invents figures where there are none. But the evidence is difficult to ignore. Hunters' camps left abandoned, rifles in the snow, meals half-eaten, tracks that circle cabins but never lead away, and dogs, known for their loyalty, cowering beneath porches, refusing to make a sound until daylight returns. The people of Kalak live with this reality. They lock doors even when the wind howls at -50. They hang charms carved from bone above thresholds, gifts from elders said to confuse the faceless ones. Some keep fires burning all night, though wood is scarce. Above all, they warn outsiders never to answer if they hear someone calling their name in the night. The shadows know what you fear, one old woman told a researcher. They borrow voices. If you speak back, they will follow you home. Even now, Kalak's population dwindles. Families move south, drawn by city lights, tired of winters haunted by silence. But for those who remain, the stories continue. Just last year, a snowplow driver swore he saw a line of people walking across the frozen river at dusk. At first, he thought it was a funeral procession. But the figures never broke formation, never stumbled, never left prints. They marched into the darkness until they could no longer be seen. What the people of Kalak know, and what outsiders struggle to believe, is that the polar night is not empty. It hides things that slip between shadow and flesh, things that remember when the land was theirs alone. Whether spirits of the lost guardians of the river or something older than human memory, no one dares to say. But when the nights grow long and the dogs refuse to bark, the villagers know the watchers have returned. And as they whisper in the safety of their cabins, one thought chills them most. The shadows are patient, and one day they may not be content to simply watch. The Chilkoot Pass has always demanded a price from those who dared to cross it. Rising above the jagged border between Alaska and Canada, this narrow mountain corridor was once the gateway for thousands of fortune seekers during the Klondike Gold Rush. Photographs from the late 1800s show endless lines of men trudging up its icy steps, each carrying the supplies that weighed them down as much as their greed for gold. Many never returned. Avalanches claimed entire parties. Frostbite left bodies stiff and unrecognizable, and starvation hollowed out those too stubborn to turn back. Yet long before prospectors carved their misery into the landscape, the Tlingit people warned that the pass was haunted. They said spirits lingered there, guardians of the mountains who did not welcome trespassers. And even today, when the storms roll over the peaks and the wind whistles like a chorus of screams, travelers swear the pass has never let go of its dead. Modern accounts make it difficult to dismiss the legends as nothing more than history. In 1978, a group of college students attempted a winter trek across the pass. Only 3 returned. The others were found days later, half buried in the snow. Rescue workers claimed the scene was strange. The students' gear was intact, food still plentiful, and their tent stood upright as though carefully abandoned. Their bodies were discovered sprawled on the ice, faces frozen in expressions of sheer terror. Autopsies found no injuries, no frostbite severe enough to cause collapse. It was as though they had simply lain down in the snow and surrendered. One rescuer later confided to a journalist that when he reached the site, he felt he was being watched from the cliffs above. Like someone was standing just out of sight, he said, waiting for me to look up. The pass is notorious for strange sounds. Climbers tell of hearing boots crunching in the snow behind them, only to turn and find empty slopes. Some describe the metallic clatter of picks and pans, ghostly echoes of the gold rush stamped into the mountains. In 1993, a pair of hikers camping on the Canadian side reported being woken by voices outside their tent, low murmurs as though men were arguing. When they unzipped the flap, their lantern illuminated nothing but blowing snow. Still, the voices persisted for nearly an hour, circling the camp. By dawn, the couple found a ring of footprints in the snow, wide and uneven, yet leading nowhere. The tracks began in a perfect circle around their tent and ended in the same way, as if the figures had materialized from the night and then vanished back into it. One of the most unsettling stories comes from a park ranger stationed near the pass in 2006. He was alone in his cabin when he heard a frantic knock at the door just after midnight. Opening it, he found no one there. But in the snow, he spotted what looked like bare footprints leading away from the porch, bare feet, in -15 degrees, heading toward the ridge. He followed them with his flashlight for several yards before they simply stopped, mid-stride, in the middle of the open slope. He wrote the event into his logbook, but later admitted to colleagues that he'd felt something pressing on his chest the entire time, as though the mountain itself wanted him to turn back. Even experienced mountaineers describe encounters they cannot explain. In 2014, a climber named Aaron Halstead attempted to summit a nearby peak with 2 friends. A sudden blizzard forced them to camp on a narrow ledge. That night, Aaron woke to the sound of someone whispering directly into his ear. He assumed it was one of his partners, but when he looked, both were asleep in their bags. The whisper came again, his own name, carried on a voice that seemed both male and female, young and old. He swore he felt breath on his cheek, though the tent was sealed. At dawn, they found strange markings in the snow just outside, long streaks as if something had dragged itself on hands and knees around their tent. The others refused to continue and descended. Aaron made it home, but he later told reporters that when he closed his eyes at night, he could still hear the whisper calling his name. Folklore insists that the pass is not merely dangerous terrain, but a place where the living and the dead brush too closely. Tlingit stories speak of the Yale Kook, shadow wanderers, spirits of those who perished on the trail. They are said to resent the living for trespassing where their suffering ended. Elders warn that if you encounter one, you must not acknowledge it. If you lock eyes, the spirit will follow you for the rest of your journey, waiting for a moment of weakness to claim you. What unnerves researchers is how these warnings align with modern accounts. Hikers often describe the sensation of being followed, a pressure at the back of the skull, eyes boring into them from behind. Many admit they quicken their pace, too afraid to glance over their shoulder. There are even stranger reports. In 2019, a documentary crew filming the history of the Klondike captured audio on one of their cameras after leaving it running overnight. The recording features what sounds like a large group trudging through snow, punctuated by groans and labored breathing. Some of the voices cry out in languages no one on the crew recognized. When they played it back the next morning, the sound made several members physically ill. A local historian identified one word among the cries as Tlingit, roughly translating to turn back. Yet the slopes around their camp showed no fresh tracks. Then there are the vanishings. The Alaska State Troopers keep careful records, but certain files from the Chilkoot Pass remain unsolved. Snowshoers who left behind full packs but never returned. Tourists who strayed a few yards off trail only to be swallowed by a landscape searched dozens of times. In one case, a single glove was found pressed neatly against a rock, as though placed there deliberately. No trace of the missing hiker was ever discovered. His family swore he was careful, an experienced outdoorsman. Locals muttered that the mountain had claimed him. To this day, guides advise travelers to respect the pass. They suggest carrying charms, leaving offerings of tobacco or coins at certain points, and most importantly, never camping directly on the trail itself. Utqiagvik, the northernmost town in the United States, is a place where the sun sets in November and does not rise again until late January. For 65 days, darkness reigns, broken only by the glow of porch lights, the flicker of snowmobiles, or the cold shimmer of the aurora stretching across the sky. Outsiders think of it as an endurance test, a challenge to survive months without daylight. But those who live there know the true trial of the polar night isn't the cold, or the hunger, or the silence. It's what comes with the dark. For in Utqiagvik, there are things that walk when the sun is gone, and not all of them are human. The Inupiat people have lived in this land for centuries, and their stories run like veins through the permafrost. They speak of the Tunbak, a spirit beast born of hunger and endless night, stalking the tundra for those who wander too far from the safety of the village. They whisper of the dark watchers, tall silhouettes seen at the edge of the frozen sea, staring but never moving, figures that seem to multiply the longer you look at them. Elders warn children not to follow strange lights across the ice, for they may not belong to the aurora at all. And while scientists dismiss these tales as folklore shaped by harsh winters, every year the darkness brings fresh accounts that are harder to explain. In December of 1981, a police officer patrolling near the old DW line station received a call about a man seen walking alone on the ice road toward the ocean. When the officer arrived, he spotted the figure, tall, broad-shouldered, trudging against the wind. Pulling alongside in his cruiser, he rolled down the window and shouted. The figure turned its head, and the officer later swore under oath that the face he saw was featureless, smooth as ice. He stumbled, hit the gas, and sped back to town, refusing to patrol that stretch again. The next day, tracks were found on the ice road, deep impressions leading toward the sea, and then nothing. The prints stopped halfway across, as though the walker had vanished into the frozen air. In 1997, an oil worker stationed at Prudhoe Bay took a snowmobile ride during the long night to clear his head. Hours later, he returned shaken, frostbitten, rambling about children on the ice. He claimed he saw a small group of them huddled near an abandoned rig, their bodies stiff, their faces pale blue in the dark. Believing they were lost, he approached, but as his headlights swept across them, the children dissolved into black smoke that drifted upward and vanished into the aurora. He quit his contract days later, telling his co-workers the Arctic was cursed land. His story was dismissed as fatigue and cold-induced hallucination, yet others whispered that he wasn't the first to see such figures. Stranger still are the accounts tied to the aurora itself. Most see it as a ribbon of beauty, dancing green across the sky. But some nights, when the air is still and the cold bites deepest, the lights take on a shape that unsettles even lifelong residents. In 2013, a group of teachers walking home from a school gathering swore they saw faces in the aurora, huge, stretched expressions rippling across the sky, mouths opening and closing as if screaming silently. One of the teachers fainted on the spot. Another refused to leave her house after dark for the remainder of the season. When scientists were consulted, they suggested pareidolia, the human tendency to see patterns in randomness. But locals shook their heads. The lights are alive, one elder said. They're hungry. Perhaps the most chilling testimony came from a woman named Sarah Kallick in 2005. She lived alone in a small cabin outside the main part of town, preferring solitude. During one polar night, she reported strange knocks on her door just after midnight. 3 knocks, evenly spaced. At first she ignored them, but they returned night after night, always the same. One evening, she gathered her courage and flung the door open, shotgun in hand. There was nothing there. The snow lay untouched, but she heard breathing, slow, heavy, just beyond the glow of her lantern. She retreated inside, locked every latch, and sat awake until dawn. Weeks later, when the sun returned, neighbors found her cabin abandoned. Food still sat on the table. Clothes hung neatly in the closet. Sarah was never seen again. The military, too, has their share of strange files. Though most remain classified, former contractors have spoken anonymously about incidents during the long night. One told of motion sensors at the old radar station tripping constantly, detecting movement on the tundra when no one was there. Security teams sent to investigate found only deep impressions in the snow, long dragging lines as though something enormous had crawled across the ice. Another spoke of comms filled with whispers, voices calling out the names of soldiers who weren't on duty. No official reports mention these details, but locals believe the government knows more than it admits. What makes the polar night so terrifying is not just the legends, but the silence that swallows all reason. Imagine standing on the edge of the frozen sea at 2 in the morning. The sky glows faintly green, the ice groans beneath itself, and every sound carries for miles. A crack of ice could be a shifting current, or footsteps. A shadow on the horizon could be a trick of light, or something waiting. Hunters say the land feels alive in those months, watching, listening, testing, and more than one hunter has returned babbling about something moving under the ice. In 2018, a young man walking home from a bar vanished on the short stretch between buildings. Security cameras caught him leaving, staggering slightly, but confident on his path. Midway across the snow, the footage shows him pause, as though listening. He tilts his head, looks up at the sky, and then begins walking deliberately toward the ocean, away from the streetlights. His body was never found. Search teams scoured the ice. Helicopters scanned the sea, but no trace emerged. The last image on camera remains chilling. The young man striding into the black, his shadow stretching unnaturally long behind him, as though something far taller was walking in step. Utqiagvik's elders say the polar night isn't empty. It's crowded. Every soul lost to the ice, every wanderer who followed a voice into the dark, every traveler who gazed too long at the lights, they remain. The night belongs to them, and when the sun sets for the season, the boundary between the living and the dead grows thin. Outsiders may laugh at the stories, but they do not stay through the months of darkness. They do not wake to whispers at their windows, or see faceless silhouettes standing in the glow of the aurora. They do not understand the true weight of silence in a land that has buried thousands. As the long night deepens, the people of Utqiagvik gather close, keeping their lights burning, their doors locked, their prayers whispered. And yet, no lock can keep out the cold. No flame can drive back the horizon. The truth is simple and unbearable. In Utqiagvik, when the sun disappears, something else takes its place. And if you listen too closely, you may hear it calling you by name.